I want to start off today's episode with discussing a dream that I had recently, or perhaps you could call it a nightmare. So I opened up Instagram and I saw that Jake was doing a podcast, but it wasn't with me. It was with Dr. Mike Israel. And I was there baffled, saying, have I been replaced? Is this the end of the road for me? What about the training arc, Jake? And then I was a fly on the wall, and I got insight after the podcast. They went to go eat some nice Japanese food, sushi. They trained. They went to an anime convention. They did all the things I wish I could be doing with Jake. And I was sad. I cried for a while. Didn't know what to do. But honestly, I couldn't blame him because Dr. Mike Israel, he's really cool, a lot cooler than me. But I was hurt, and I woke up from the dream, and today was the day we had to record, and I was like, I don't know what's real and what's not. So when I sent the invite for this recording, I didn't know if he's gonna show up, but he did, and we're here, and we're back, and in the future, I'm assuming we're gonna get tattoos of the training arc on our chest. But that's just I don't want to jump ahead. So Jake, welcome back.
This is just like an epilogue where I come back and say hi again, right? Because the thing about a training arc is it ends, and you got to start the new arc. So I'm on to bigger and better things. I'm sorry.
Wait till my villain arc starts now. After this, that's gonna be
that's where we're at.
Here we go. This is gonna be interesting, but we'll save that for another day. But we're here, and as we always do, we just think about what could we talk about? What's some interesting stuff? What's going on social media, or what could we provide for the audience that would be practical, that would be useful, and just something fun to talk about. And for me, I love program design, right? I think creating a program is fun to think about. Maybe we're biased because we're coaches and really like that idea of it, but it's one of those things again where it's hard to do. There's so many things to consider, and perhaps even sometimes we think too much about it, right? So I think it'll be cool to discuss, hey, if we want to start creating a program, either for ourselves or for someone else, where do we start? What things do we think of? And then more so focusing on the practical side of things. So I think that's where we're going to go today.
So what I'm hearing is there is a single best program that we're going to create that will give everybody perfect gains, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the secret. Like this is the only video anyone will ever need to watch ever again.
Yeah, and it's actually locked behind a $10.99 subscription per month too. That just isn't bad, honestly, when you think about it. So
right.
You're welcome in advance, people. That's why we're here. But it's maybe we do. I don't know. Tell me, where are we starting, Jake? How do we create a program?
That's honestly is even just that is a can of worms, right? Because I think there's multiple places you can start, but I think you and I are pretty similar. That it helps to almost kind of like reverse engineer it a little bit. Like, what's the person's end goal, right? And I think we're going to talk about that a lot. That individualizing everything that we're doing is important. And funny enough, that's sort of become a hot button word, individualization. So Zach Robinson, Dr. Zach Robinson now, since he has graduated, his dissertation looked at individual response variation, what it's called, right? The idea that different people respond to different protocols best and that sort of thing. And or that the same person will respond to different protocols very differently, and like how will we measure these things, detect these things. And he came out of this with it's incredibly difficult to detect that sort of thing, right? So when he started talking about this, now people kind of went too far the other direction sometimes of like, oh, this is pointless, and what's even the reasoning of thinking about this stuff, and we can't even figure out if something's different for different people. But at the end of the day, and he'll say this exact same thing too, and he has said this, that although it's difficult to like measure and predict the best protocol for somebody, and it's really hard to tell some of those things on like a physiological level, that the external variables, your sleep and your stress and your schedule and all these constraints, like those are the reasons we still have to individualize stuff, right? So even if on a physiological level it might not be what we thought it was before, we still got to do it, right? It's just maybe a different reason. So we're going to talk about those things, I'm sure, quite a bit on how to get as close to an optimal program as we can, given the constraints of all those other things. So I think that's probably where we both tend to start, is what's the person's end goal? What constraints are we working with? And then we kind of work from there to place everything together. Would you agree with that, or am I misrepresenting you?
I think that was extremely well put. Yeah, and like you said, it is a very difficult topic to talk about because, like you said, there's so much to consider. And should we even consider it? And I think you hit it on your head. It's like, hey, we need somewhere to start. And I think that's where we look to science. And like we talked about before in the past, we need somewhere to see that, hey, there's been some evidence saying roughly around X amount of variables here, and this amount of volume, this amount of intensity. We're going to start there and then collect data on ourselves or your client, whoever it may be, and then adjust accordingly. And we'll probably repeat that as well a lot throughout this, but it's just, we do need to consider the context, right? But regardless, I think keeping it simple, focusing on the basics is where we kind of want to drift towards. And I think that's where this will be useful for anybody, right? If you're just new, starting off and don't have a program yourself right now and you don't know where to go, or if you're someone who's very well versed in creating programs or with the literature, maybe, if you're on the latter part, you've spent too much time majoring in the minors, thinking about things that are, just, yes, they may be important to consider, but how much do we get in return? And are you focusing so much on that, you're missing out on the basics of just recovery or whatever it might be, right? That we'll talk about. So I think it's useful for anyone to think about. And I'm talking to myself here too, because sometimes, we're so deep in it. We're like, yes, this paper came out. Now I need to adjust this because we're starting to drift towards this part in the research now. But does that actually matter? How do I approach it? How do I dissect that? And these are, again, tough questions to ask and to approach, but that's why we're here, keeping it practical and just focusing on, tangible things that we can do.
Yeah.
And with that, it starts with goals, right? There's typically the first goal you start with is, are you going to be strength focused or are you going to be hypertrophy focused? Because from there, you can create very different programs. And the reason why we start with those is because, again, it's going to dictate the choices we make, but also as we progress through that program, when things come up and we need to adjust, we're going to rely back on that goal again, because it'll be different how we adjust based on the goal, based on where you're at for competition, all these things, right? I think there's a lot, again, to play with it, but having a very clear goal in mind is super helpful because, again, something to relate back to. So with it being the training arc and us focusing a little bit more on bodybuilding, this episode at least, we're going to focus more on maximizing hypertrophy or just hypertrophy in general. But even with that, again, looking at strength hypertrophy, I personally like to start with the idea of that is a spectrum. If we're talking about complete maximizing strength, complete maximizing hypertrophy, and where along that you want to lie, right? Because not everyone's gonna be like, I want to be a powerlifter, maximize strength, or I want to be a bodybuilder, maximize hypertrophy. Maybe it's a little bit of both, but maybe it's not directly in the middle. Maybe it's a little bit more focused to hypertrophy, but still liking the big three of squat, bench, and deadlift. So I think first off, realizing that it is a spectrum of strength and hypertrophy can be very helpful. So yeah, is that something that you also consider or do or think about
100%.
in that sense? Yeah.
100%, 100%. Like I think there's actually quite a few people I've worked with where it's like we wind up in this, what's the minimum effective dose of one of those things, and then we kind of fill in the rest of our recovery capacity with the other one.
You didn't say trademark pack after that.
Yeah, sorry.
Effective dose, so I have to call you out for that. Sorry.
Sorry. But that's part of why his research is really cool, right? Is it's so directly applicable to a lot of people's goals. A lot of people want both. Right now I don't care about strength, but like a large part of my training career has been wanting both. But I think that maybe another good thing to mention on the front end, because I think you did a great job of explaining that depending on where you're at in that spectrum, when we go to adjust the program, we're going to adjust things slightly differently. And so I guess just so people have the framework, right? And chime in too if you think of this a little bit differently. But for me, like putting it as basically as I can, the more people are leaning the strength direction, the more I'm like, okay, most important things for that goal, load, and like fatigue management, making sure that our fatigue doesn't get too high. Like we want to make sure that we're not sabotaging performance, right? Versus the more they're leaning towards the hypertrophy side, it's more like volume and intensity, making sure that our workload is, high, but we can still recover reliably, and making sure that we're getting at least close to failure. We don't have to go all the way there, as I'm sure we'll talk about some of those things more later. But like those are the levers that I'm kind of working. So if somebody's all hypertrophy, I don't care so much about load, right? Like I'm going to adjust these other things. Somebody's all strength, it's vice versa. If someone's in the middle, gets a little bit murky, so you just have to really pay attention and sort of think through what are the trade-offs I'm making. Does that work with this client's goals, so on and so forth. But do you agree with that? Are there other things that you pay attention? I guess, there's things like exercise selection and whatnot as well. But
Yeah, I think as a whole, yeah, it all comes down to fatigue management. But again, depending on the goal, that's going to be different things, right? Fatigue management for strength in the realm of most likely being related to strength, so squat, bench, and deadlift, right? Whereas fatigue management for bodybuilding is, are you recovering enough from the amount of volume you're doing so that when you hit your next session, you're recovered? It's still probably the same idea for both in some regard, but we're looking at the metrics of volume a bit more for hypertrophy and strength load a bit more for the strength. And then again, with strength, just the idea and concept of managing joint aches and all that stuff too. So that's why strength is just a whole nother game. And it's like, okay, that's why we're going to give a whole episode to it, I think, which will be helpful. But yeah, it just, like you said, it comes down to that fatigue management. And I think it's helpful to know that. But again, it all relates to that goal. So I think if we're looking at hypertrophy, I think one thing again, maybe we're talking about maximizing hypertrophy. One place to start there too, and you briefly mentioned it right there, is just the idea of exercise selection, right? Because I might ruffle some feathers here, but perhaps if you're maximizing hypertrophy, you don't need to do the barbell specific lifts of squat, bench, and deadlift. I'm sorry. I know. It's don't hit an episode. No, don't. But yeah, I think it's something that perhaps is a lot more well received now. Mm-hmm. But previously, a couple of years ago, even, it was unheard of. Like you said that you would get that exact reaction that you had. What do you mean? Like the squat is the king of exercises. You need to be doing it because you're going to be, that's how you maximize gains. That's just known. But as we're starting to get more information, as the science is starting to come out, we're starting to create more knowledge and experiment with these things, we're getting maybe further from that idea and more focusing on, again, not the basics, or basics plus things that do matter. And for hypertrophy, you hear it often now a lot too, just the idea of mechanical tension, briefly, but just like targeting the muscle that we want to be working, right? And loading that through its full stretch, whatever it may be. So if we want to work the muscle that we want to work and make sure that is its limiting factor within the exercise, if you take something like a barbell back squat, there's so many other variables to consider. Your bracing, your breathing, stability, coordination, the list goes on and on, right? And if we're trying to maximize hypertrophy, still can be an option, right? I'm not saying it's terrible, you should just not do it, but is it going to be the best option? Maybe not, depending on all these resources that you have available, both in terms of time, energy allocation, or maybe you just have a barbell and that's what you have to do, right? So there's ways that we can think about it, but thinking about starting with the exercises that we're doing, how it relates to your goal can be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I was just going to throw that in there too. And you kind of said it there at the end that like, if you really want to do the barbell lifts, you can, right? Like it's not that that's stupid. There might be slightly better choices in a vacuum, but like you can do some other things. Like if you really want to squat, or maybe you have to squat because that's all the equipment you have. Yeah. There's some techniques we can use to make it a little bit more hypertrophy friendly compared to like a powerlifting style squat, right? And we can talk about some of those things, too, as we kind of get into some of these other variables. But yeah, I agree that that's kind of the nice thing about hypertrophy. We have so much more flexibility, and there's just so much more like variety at our disposal with exercise selection, which is nice because a lot of the other variables can feel so consistent, to put it in the nicest way, that some people get bored over time, right? So the ability to shift between different exercises and stuff can be really helpful. Whereas with strength, it's not, the programming, the rep ranges and stuff is usually what's changing, and that's keeping things fresh. But muscle growth can feel a bit monotonous for some, right? So nice to have access to various exercises. Let me kind of think through this, so do we want to get into those other variables now, or do you want to start with more bigger structural things
I think
and then kind of go.
yeah, maybe slightly more structural first and then
Yeah,
the variables. Because I think we briefly touched upon it, but to put it very straightforward, like I think you have your goal, and then from there, it's that idea of resource allocation, right? So,
yeah,
so first off, like how many days per week can you train? I
right,
very specifically say can because yes, we'd all love to train more or less even for some people, but how many days can you consistently train?
yeah,
And then from there, with each session, how much time can you spend in the gym? Because from there, it does a lot of the legwork early on if we know what we're working with there, right? Instead of being, hey, you're doing 5 times a week because I said so, or that's where I normally start. Maybe someone can't do 5 times a week. Maybe they can only do two or do three. So we need to start there to discuss, okay, how are we going to then disseminate the rest of the variables. So I think that's makes it easier for everyone if we're figuring
yeah,
out, hey, what we got for resources. And then also on the idea of resource allocation is what equipment are we working with? Are we in your garage and we just have a barbell where like we talked about just a bit before, we can only really do barbell variations of squats? Or do you have access to a full kitted gym? Or do you have like a niche kitted gym where we have pendulum squats, we have the prime handles, and we have we can lengthen bias machines? What are we working with? Right. So from there you can then tailor your program. Because if you start too early on or too far ahead, you're going to be working your way back, or you're going to be thinking that your program is quote unquote suboptimal, and then you might not enjoy it, or you're just going to set yourself up for some type of failure in some way, right?
yeah,
And then again, as we're always going to talk about, we really just want to focus on adherence and consistency. What's going to make you come to the gym more frequently, consistently, and stringing together really good sessions in weeks and months and years of training.
yeah,
If we take the time early on to set up a program that really focuses on that, then that's where the success comes. And you just got to give it a little bit of time and put in the effort, right? We can't just be like, okay, well, Chris Bumstead's doing this, so it looks like it's 6 times per week training push pull legs. Let's go.
yeah, right, right,
Hey, that might work for you if you can do that and you enjoy it. But a lot of people, I would say maybe not, right? So I think resource allocation, specifically days per week, you can train, how much time per session you can train, uh, equipment that you're working with, and then from there it's kind of easy to work out what your training split is going to look like for your week. Right, split meaning, are you doing full body sessions, upper lower, push pull legs, um, any type of variation of that too, right? It doesn't have to be upper lower, it could be full body, but full body is 5 upper exercises and you're throwing calves in there. So whatever
sure,
split it is what you're doing, but it's easy to do that once you figure out goal, resources.
yeah. Um, and I think just to sort of piggyback on that too, and really interesting conversation that we were having in our lab yesterday, actually, that I think directly applies to this. Just because you mentioned like what can you consistently do, right? Like what is it's the base of the pyramid, right? Adherence and consistency. And
I'm gonna do it again. You didn't trademark Eric Helms after saying the
trademark
word pyramid. Come on,
trademark
Jay.
pyramid shape.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what? You know what's really funny? That was actually my first interaction with him on social media. As I made a post that had like a base of the pyramid, whatever. It was very clearly inspired, and I think I certainly hope that I gave credit to him in the thing. But he made a joke like, "Hey, like yeah,
Yeah,
something about trademark this shape or something."
yeah.
Anyway, funny.
Nice.
But we so that's the goal, right? What can we consistently do? And I think there's a few things to consider there. One, obviously, that you also mentioned, like what's realistic if you work 10-hour shifts 3 days a week or whatever. Like maybe you don't want to train on those days. You want to go the other 4 days or something. Cool. Or whatever your work schedule is, family schedule, school schedule, etc. Like what's baseline actually realistic? I think that's one piece. I think there is the like what do you enjoy? What's the enjoy? Did you smile at One Piece?
I wanted to say, you got to trademark it, but I stopped myself. But I smiled and you saw it, so I'm sorry. Okay, I'll stop. The One Piece is real.
Speaking of One Piece, I finished Water 7. For those that know, I finished Water 7. I'm through Post Ennie's Lobby, and I am fully bought in and so invested in the story. It is. I understand. It is S tier. I get it. I'm on board. Okay.
It only took you 1,000 episodes. Wow, crazy.
Yeah. Right.
No, damn. Now I'm gonna get the hate comments. And
Yeah.
all right,
No, I think it's honestly like 400 and something chapters in at this point, and I'm like maybe a quarter of the way done or a third of the way done. Anyway.
I'll stop.
So we have the realistic, we have the enjoyment piece, and this is circling back to the conversation that we were having in our lab yesterday. Dr. Zordos was mentioning just this idea of enjoyment leads to consistency with exercise, and therefore making progress. And he was just like talking about how he kind of looked into that even more, and there's really not the research to back that. Like, obviously, logically, it makes sense, but there's not like a bunch of research data that links enjoyment to consistency and results in the long term. I think it makes a lot of sense that it would be that, but it was just interesting. And so he also mentioned, and I completely agree with this, that what makes you enjoy training and be consistent with seeing results, right? So like that's I think a very key piece here too, is that we got to make sure whatever setup that we do, while it needs to be realistic, we got to make sure it's actually going to lead to progress for people. Otherwise, why would they keep doing it? Why would they be consistent with it? So I think, we got to get all those things in place, which hopefully through talking through these things, we can, get people the tools to be able to create those things that check all those boxes. And luckily for hypertrophy, there's a lot of ways we can do it. We have a lot of flexibility at our disposal, like we said. So, but yeah, at the end of the day, we got to make sure that we can be consistent with it, because it takes a long time to build muscle, unfortunately.
Yeah, that was the can that I was about to open with what you said. It's like, hey, if we're focused on hypertrophy, results is what gets us. But hypertrophy takes time. So then there's like that endless loop of how do we focus on results and then enjoyment if results equals enjoyment. And I think we can talk about that a lot more in a full-on episode, because that's extremely interesting. But that just goes back to things that we've said before of just enjoy it and trust the process. And if you're checking boxes of probably covering most of what the literature is saying is going to get you gains, best case scenario, you're going to stay the same. Worst case scenario, rather, you're going to stay the same, which is still not
Oh
bad.
no.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Realistic. But then it's like, hey, we're going to make some gains. And even that, we just have more work or more data to work with that gives us a better decision making down the line, right? So don't get caught up in that. You'll be fine. Trust me. Just work hard when it comes down to it. As simple as it sounds.
Honestly, yeah. Which I'm sure we'll circle back to at the end.
So many circles and cans and.
Yeah.
but I think it's funny, and that's why it's tough to talk about, and that's why there's so much information out there, and it's hard to make it tangible, but it's important to. And when it comes down to it, is sticking to those pillars of what the goal is, of what you're enjoying, consistency, because there's so much to think about, you can get so caught up in it. And this is again where early on we talked about maybe some of the coaches who have been in it for a while or are very science focused can fall short of helping some people out, because it's harder for them to see that, or they come from a different perspective where it's not science based, where one client you can nerd out with, but someone's just very straightforward. Like I said, I'm very busy. I just want to be able to be consistent with my training and enjoy that, and be able to carry my groceries and play with my kids and do all these things. So, what do I do? Right. So I think it's that idea of, again, resource allocation. And in that case, like you talked about, energy allocation. That's something I always like to talk about, is that idea of how much energy do you have? And like you said, if you have a lot of work going on, or you have a family trip, how realistic is it that you're going to get into training? Right. So that idea too is very much part of the resources side of things. So yeah, we have our goal. We have the idea of what we can do, what the resources are. And from there, like we said, it makes it a little bit easier to figure out what that split is going to look like. But then with the split comes, again, to make it even easier, I think a great place to start is just the idea of, how much frequency you're doing. So how often are you, in this case, we're going to talk about frequency as how often are you hitting the same muscle group within that week? And it's easy to set it up with doing at least 2, right? Because from there, okay, I need to have 2 days where I'm either doing 2 full body days, upper, lower, push, pull, whatever it is, right? But from there, you have the ability to separate the amount of work they do, or the volume rather, and from there keep the quality of the work high and train hard and focus on recoverability rather than doing so much in one session or trying to figure out how you're going to squeeze it all in one session. Because I think that's another thing that can be easy to fall into is, I have 2 or 3 days to train. How can I do it all in this session, or this week rather, and then within this block? But that's the thing. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to do everything in one block. It could be your whole macro cycle throughout the year, right? Like you don't have to hit every single muscle group, every single division head of that muscle group in that one block. It could be spread out throughout, right? So I think it's important to recognize that and practically think about it. Okay, for this block, let me at least hit 2 times per week frequency. Start from there.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that maybe a helpful mental construct is and this is sort of our plan on how we want to frame this today too, is sort of like a home base. Like this will check your boxes on like a basic level, and then we can kind of get into some of the certain situations, maybe you want to try this or whatever, right? Some of the little, flares and cherries on top and whatnot that you can play with, but none of that stuff should ever sabotage these like home base foundational things. And I totally agree. I think starting with the frequency of twice a week for each muscle is a great way to start. You certainly can go higher than that, especially some smaller muscles that tend to recover faster or whatever. But I think it's a great home base. And one thing I also want to mention is that this is something I learned from my coach years ago, is like the idea of it doesn't all have to be even, right? Like, and you mentioned this too earlier, like maybe you have 2 upper body days, but one of them is more of a chest and triceps focus with a little bit of back and biceps, and then the other one is the opposite. Like, you can do stuff like that. You can also do stuff like you just said, where maybe you're, for example, if we're getting into some of the nuanced stuff, you probably want to have some tricep work where your arms are overhead to get a little bit more long head emphasis, whatever. You don't have to do that every training block, right? You can shift in and out of doing whatever. You can have like muscle group specialization things where you're focusing more on certain muscles, other ones you're doing a little bit less, and then you switch that in future blocks. You can even do, and this is the thing I learned from my coach that I really liked, is not every session has to be super difficult. Like maybe you have, like for me, for example, how my training was set up, it was 5 days that were all really hard, right? And then what we ended up doing was we took some of the training in one of the days and put just a little bit of it into each of the other 4. So like those other 4 days, they were already really hard. So we made them just barely harder. But then the one workout was way easier. It's kind of like getting a refeed with your training. So it was like you have these they're hard anyway. If we make them just a touch harder, I don't even notice it. But then I have this one session where I can come up for air and just have like, like it almost feels like a deload, like a little mini deload every week. And it's like rejuvenating. It's like you can do cool stuff like that, right? So I guess the reason I bring that up is just that there is quite literally infinite ways that you can do stuff like this. But the idea is to take the concepts that we're talking about with how we're trying to present this with like, here's like a foundational home base thing that checks the boxes. We'll mention some of the other stuff. Don't get too bogged down in the weeds. Always come back to your home base and then, apply the little fun extra things either as needed or as if somebody has the availability and the energy and the time and they want to do those things, you can, of course, do that. And sometimes maybe it is slightly more optimal, right? Like some of these things certainly do make a difference. So if somebody is able to do it, it probably helps a little bit. But
I think that's well said. And I think let's give an example of how you might approach that, right? Because I think in general, when I'm looking at my split or how I'm going to set up my weekly volume, I like to break it up for muscle group, right? Because we talked about how I'm going to hit every division of this or do this for variation. Start with each muscle group. And then from there, a very practical thing to think about, and not to get super in depth with like anatomy and stuff like that too, is okay, like what is the action that the muscle does, right? And how can I load that action as best as possible? To keep it super simple, again, if we're looking at the chest, I always like to start with the basic of I have a flat press variation and a fly variation. I can do that in a block and be very successful, both with my own training or other clients' training. And then from there, okay, can we add in another 4 sets or 3 sets of maybe we'll do an incline this block, run that block. Maybe we'll do a decline variation or quote unquote, maybe hitting the lower pecs a little bit more, or just having another variation for the sake of difference and fun and skill acquisition, because sometimes that can keep training exciting, right? But I still have the basics of a press, typically a flat press if we're trying to encompass everything, and a fly. And that's it's almost like an 80-20 rule of training, like that we always talk about for nutrition, right? 80% of it stick to those basics. And then the other 20 is where you cycle in and out of blocks. Like, okay, this block, maybe I'm going to have an overhead tricep movement. This next block, maybe I'm just focusing on a push down, have enough triceps for my pressing, and that's it. And we'll see how that takes me and how I like that. And then reassess, do I have room to do more, or do I want to bring up my triceps a little bit more? Focus on that, right? I think it's focus on those basics, the 80-20. From there, adjust based on that goal again, and based on where you're at on the whole macro cycle of the year of training of how can I fit this in based on where I want to be and where I need to be. So I think it's kind of a way to look at it too is yeah, just it's fun. We're experimenting at the same time, and to give yourself that certainty, as long as you do those main things that you know are going to work. I have a squat pattern and a leg extension. I have a flat press and a fly. I have a hinge pattern, and that's the idea of focusing on patterns. Again, we're going to trademark the muscle pyramids again. It's just squat pattern, hinge pattern, vertical press and pull, horizontal press pull. Those, as long as I have those six, like I am covering everything. Then I'll sprinkle in some arm specific work, some calf specific work, abs, rear delt, whatever it is that I want to bring up or need to bring up based on my goal of, what it is.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that at the end. Always come back to the person's goals, right?
Yeah.
If they want to grow some muscle and that's all their goal is, we don't need to do all the bells and whistles, right? If they want to be the best bodybuilder they possibly can be on stage, we got to think through a lot of these little details. So it all comes back to that person.
To make that super clear of like the difference, most powerlifters, you're not going to program calf raises. You're not going to, because technically it might be a bad thing. Maybe their calves get so big they can't bring up their knee sleeves. And they need those knee sleeves up, right? And does the calf contribute much to a squat or deadlift? I could say pretty confidently no. Maybe for the calf, you can make an argument. Cool, you're able to get more dorsiflexion if you're training your calves. Maybe I could see that because I just like calves. But for the most part, no. Right? That's like lower tier, if you would, or lower on the priority list of that. Right? Same thing with maybe like biceps for a powerlifter. Less important than maybe triceps that have probably a more direct, relation to pressing movements. Right? So again, that's why we talked about before. We keep referring back to what's the goal? What's the goal? Does this in line with it? Is it helpful? Looking at the macro cycle. Check. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, okay. So we have our realistic, how many days per week we can go to the gym, roughly how much time we want to be able to spend there. We have our starting on average twice a week for each muscle group. You probably don't want to do those on back-to-back days if possible, right? I don't think that's the worst thing in the world if you have to do that. Like some people can only train Tuesday, Friday, Saturday, right? So like you might be in a situation, or maybe you have an extra work meeting. So I can't go to the gym today. I'll push it till tomorrow. That means I'm doing shoulders 2 days in a row. It's probably fine, right? But for the most part, we want to try to avoid that if we can. But we have our roughly average frequency there. Next up, I usually start looking at like set numbers next. I don't know about you, but it seems like you're the same based on kind of nodding. So maybe that's a good place to start in a general recommendation for starting place with that. And this is a tricky one also, right? So frequency kind of is too, we just had a new preprint go up from our lab, currently in review for publication. Hopefully, we get good news. But like on the frequency side for hypertrophy, like there's really not strong evidence for an independent effect of frequency, meaning like it doesn't seem to matter very much how frequently you hit the muscle, as long as we're getting enough volume in. So it seems like that's but practically speaking, most people probably don't want to do everything in one session, right? Because you can probably do more total volume if you split it up, which is probably a net positive. So that's kind of that's why we kind of settle on frequency. Probably better to do it more than once. Although I think you can get great results training each muscle once a week. On the volume side, it's seeming like it's maybe slightly more volume than some previous recommendations, but it's not that dissimilar. Previously, we had the big meta-analysis from Schoenfeld et al. Back in 2017. It had that general dose response, meaning more volume on average led to more growth. And they kind of found this like 10 or more sets is better than less than that, right? So like we didn't really know a top end. There's been some other stuff that's kind of hinting at, maybe in that 20-ish range is sort of a reasonable top end. There was recently some more studies that have been coming out that are very high volume studies that we tend to see the higher volume groups grow the most. And, these studies all have limitations, right? Which is why we need meta-analysis. And that's what our recent paper was. And so we're sort of finding I hesitate to say this, right? The point of diminishing returns, because technically it's diminishing from set one, right? Every single set you do is less of a benefit than the previous set was. So it's always diminishing. But the point where it kind of becomes like, okay, this is difficult to make a strong argument that it's good to do more sets, right? Seems like it's somewhere around the kind of 20 to 30 set range, depending on how you define it. And we defined it in a couple different ways, but the best, I'm trying not to get too in the weeds of statistics, but the way that we modeled the data with our statistics, the best way to describe what we're seeing is what's called fractional sets, right? Which is basically a good example might be biceps training, right? Where like a curl is just a set for biceps, right? A lat pull down would be like one set for your lats, but half a set for your biceps because it's indirectly still training your biceps. So like if somebody's doing one set of bicep curls and one set of lat pull downs, we would quantify that for biceps as being like 1.5 sets in that workout. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like that's how we counted that. So if you're going with the fractional route, it's probably somewhere around like 30, which is more than what most people used to go by, myself included. But keeping in mind, that's also including some of that direct work in there, which previous meta-analyses have not done. That's a difference that we did. So that's probably why, at least part of why we saw that number, in addition to the recent research that just has more higher volume studies that we have access to now, and so on and so forth. Anyway, if we're thinking about maybe in slightly easier terms to think through just like a direct set, right? Like just bicep curls or whatever. And we're not really accounting for the back training so much. Limitations there, but it's a little bit more intuitive for some people. Probably looking at, that tipping point, low 20s, somewhere in there. I can't remember the exact number, but something like that. So that is like, it's hard to recommend going above that, is how I would sort of think about that. That doesn't mean you should go out and do 20 to 30 sets of every muscle group every week, right? This is the key point. We got to make sure that we are recovering. So I believe you and I are in the same boat of, okay, cool. We have this dose response relationship. More volume tends to make you grow more up until this, kind of roughly 20, 30, whatever sets that we're talking about. Let's start conservative and then experiment and kind of come upwards and see what this person not just has time for and it, can realistically stick with, but what they're recovering from. And we're not just, beating the hell out of somebody and they're not able to keep showing up and all that kind of stuff. So with that backdrop, do you have like a go-to, let's say, some clients are going to come to you where they've never lifted really before. They've never tracked their training. They don't know what they're used to doing. So we got to pick a starting point. Or some people might have some experience tracking their training or whatever. So at least you have some records to go off of to decide where to start with them or what have you. So how do you like to kind of start with picking those numbers?
Yeah, I think interestingly, I don't start differently for a complete novice and then someone who has the data.
Okay.
I will definitely consider the data they give me because it's very important.
Mm-hmm.
But unless I ask a lot more specific questions, there's so much more to consider. Like, okay, are you taking all these sets to failure? Are you like, what's your recovery looking like? Are you hitting it every other week? Like, unless I really do that, which takes a lot more time, maybe I'll start conservative and make sure that we have a lot of the basics down before we start adding volume. Mm-hmm. Meaning like, okay, make sure we're starting on the low end. And for me, that low end is going to be 6 to 8 sets per muscle group, right? Maybe we do like an intro week, the first week where it's like 6 sets per muscle group. And then from there, if recovery is completely fine, jump to 8 sets. Because for me, I always kind of refer back to that 8 to 20 recommendation that we've seen in the literature. So that 8 is a pretty good spot for practical means. And then also just like splitting up means, right? Because we can do 4 and 4 on one day and one day. Like it's super easy to consider, right? So if we're looking at there for a place to start, then we collect data, see how recovery is, and go from there. So I think starting around the 6 to 8, considering what the recovery looks like, and then importantly, and this is something that we probably find is very obvious, but we maybe didn't explicitly say it, but all of these variables do play a role in one another, right? They're related, they're synergistic. If we're increasing volume and intensity, we're increasing both, we're going to see a larger response needed for recovery, right? So like it's hard to look at each individual variable in a vacuum because that's just not how it works. We're probably trying to talk like that is the case just because it's easier to explain, but still trying to skirt around that as much as we can. Like, hey, here's the practical things, but so long as this is in place, right? Yes, 8 sets, but if you're taking them all to failure, you could be closer to the lower range than the higher range, right? So it's a very important caveat to remind yourself about. But yes, start to that 6 to 8, probably assess from there, and again, focus on that recovery. And then you said it, but it's maybe a little biased of mine because that's kind of what my PhD stuff was looking at, just the recovery. And even our narrative review, where it's like microcycle construction with the importance of recovery, right? Like that's, for me, that's what I'm going to first off. Yeah, we're going to start on this low end, see what the recovery looks like. Both like, okay, do you recover within 24 hours, 48 hours, 72? And like, what kind of recovery does that mean? Are you able to perform at the same? And that's what I'm referring to as recovery in this case. Is you're able to perform at the same level, if not better, right? So that's what I think of. Can you hit the same stuff that you did before, or even better than that? Ideally better, because we're trying to see if we can progressively overload.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what recovery means in this instance. So most of the time, starting on that low end and seeing if we can recover from that low end first and foremost. And like I said before, that I don't look at it differently for someone that's brand new versus someone else that has some data, because I want to make sure the other variables in place, like I said, right? Are you actually training to 1 rep in reserve or 2 reps in reserve on average, whatever it might be that we're aiming for? Is it a true 2 reps in reserve? Or are you saying it's 2 reps in reserve and it's actually 5 or 6? Because that makes a big difference in terms of recoverability and how much we can get away with, right? Is your technique first and foremost there, right? So if I'm going my hierarchy of check mark before I start adding volume, because I do think that volume is maybe one of the last things you should look at, and first have those basics in place again. Technique, then RER, technique and execution, RER accuracy, and recoverability. And then from there, we can play around with volume. So it's kind of a lot there, but that's like my 3 pillars to start with. Start in the low end, 6 to 8 sets per muscle group, and go from there.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I like that a lot. I think I'm ever so slightly different personally, but I think that's an amazing way to do it, right? I think that
Tell me I'm wrong. Just do it.
no, you're not wrong at all.
But that's what's so interesting, is because people do things so differently, and that's why it's cool to talk about this, because there are so many ways to approach it, right? I'm not saying my way is wrong and Jake's is wrong. It's just, hey, this is how we're approaching it, and how maybe you could try out each way and see what works for you.
Yeah, 100%. And that's like I think the important thing, especially if people have slightly different approaches, is like, why do they do it that way?
Yes.
Because then if you get that, then you can look at whatever situation you're faced with and then be like, oh, this makes sense to me to try this. And at the end of the day, it's also like, if it's too much volume or it's not enough volume, it's like, they're not going to die, right? So we can change it next week. It's fine. You can always make those adjustments. What I think I tend to err on usually starting with slightly higher volumes to start with, not crazy. If I don't have any information on somebody, I'm usually kind of starting maybe in that, like, depending on the muscle, I don't know, 8 to 12, something like that, sets a week, and then assess from there and go up or down or whatever, like you were saying. If I have the information from somebody else, like you said, those are very important questions to ask. We got to figure out all that stuff, and like, oh, you've been doing this many sets. Are you making progress? Like, because that matters, trying to figure out, were they doing too much? Were they not doing enough? Were they blah, 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 so that kind of shifts the starting point a little bit based on the follow-up to all those questions and whatnot. Right. But I think the only other thing that's slightly different from what you said is that I tend to lean a bit more on volume rather than like accuracy of RIR ratings or some of that, not by a ton, just a little bit, just because I think about, as you mentioned, they're very tied together, and the recovery piece is something that we can't overlook. Although I do have an additional thought on that I'll circle back to, but so they're tied together. They both contribute fatigue. So which one should I like lean more into, right? And there's not a correct answer. Nobody knows. I tend to feel a little bit more confident personally in the effect of volume on hypertrophy rather than the effect of proximity to failure. But that's a personal judgment call, right? So fair play to anyone who disagrees. That's totally fine. But yeah, it's a very, very minor difference, right? Like I think you can, we know that you can still grow when you're further from failure, although it's certainly less. Like the meta that Zach did, that's now published last year. The most growth was super, super close to, if not, at failure. But like there was still growth that was being detected at 9 or 10 reps in reserve, right? So like, I don't think you have to be perfect. Just like with volume, you can still grow with really low, 5 sets a week, you're still going to grow. So like, you're not going to go wrong. Ultimately, even though you might slightly prioritize one or the other, it's, it's probably still going to work. And then you just assess, how are they recovering? How are they feeling? What do they like? Maybe they hate going to failure, right? That's important information. So maybe you just get kind of close and whatever. But the one other thing that I want to get your thought on this too, because you've been more involved in like the research around recovery and fatigue and all that kind of stuff than me, is that if hypertrophy is our only goal, if I don't care about strength at all, do I actually have to be fully recovered to train again and get the same hypertrophy? Like, I personally don't think so. I think as long as you're close, then you can still provide a huge stimulus. Obviously, you don't want to be trashed and still go try to train again, right? If you're like 90, 95% recovered, I don't see why that's a huge issue. Me personally.
When you frame it like that, like 90, 95% recovered, I would agree. Because it's also within that 5 to 10% of assessing recovery. How accurate are you at gauging that? You
That's
might
the other
feel
thing.
like shit, but what we see in the research sometimes too is even though you feel like shit, you can perform the same, if not better. So
Yeah.
maybe that window that we have, we don't let that tie us down. Because if you go into that session saying, oof, I feel never recovered, I don't know, I'm going to preemptively dial it back. Why would you do that if you don't know that's necessary? Maybe hit
100%.
that first set or during your warm-up set, assess how you're feeling, and then adjust accordingly. But
Yeah.
I think going in with that preconceived notion that you're going to perform poorly is going to make you perform poorly because you're thinking that. And also
100%.
you could be holding yourself back. So I would agree when you frame it like that because
Okay.
yeah, especially for hypertrophy, right? Because that's the other thing
Strength is a
too
different
is,
game. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Especially too, if we know we can create a hypertrophy stimulus in many different ways, like just because we're not fully recovered and can't hit the same load, maybe we can do a little more reps. Maybe we can do,
Yeah.
maybe we just add another set in, or maybe, right, there's other things that could theoretically, quote unquote, make up for that not fully recoveredness, but still elicit a net growth stimulus, so to speak. Not that there's something like that, but like theoretically, yes. So yeah, I think that makes sense the way you say it like that.
It's such an interesting
It is.
question to me.
Yeah.
Like, how are we defining fatigue? How are we measuring fatigue? Can we reliably measure what we're trying to measure? Does it actually interfere with hypertrophy? Like all these, like we just don't really know. Like it makes sense, obviously. Like it makes total sense, but we don't know for sure. And that's such an interesting area. But nonetheless, it doesn't. It's easy to go down those rabbit holes, right?
Yeah.
But to bring it back home to kind of where we want to be, having a reasonable starting point with the volume, and then seeing what happens, right? What's the client's experience like, or what is your experience like if you're doing this for yourself? If you're crazy beat up all the time, it's probably too much, right? Yeah. What other indicators do you like to use to adjust volume? Maybe that's a reasonable place to start, because this is another one. Like I'm trying to look into this for my PhD because there's no research on this.
Yeah.
So like in your coaching practice or your training experience yourself as well, what have you noticed seems to be helpful information to think about?
Yeah, I think desire to train, I think, is an underrated one, right? Because it, and some of the very strict, like, you just got to train hard, bro. We'll disagree with this because you just got to train through it. But if I am going into my leg session and I really don't want to be there, why don't I want to be there? Because my quads maybe still feel a little bit more from the session before, and I am in week 6 of my block. It's still, maybe that's not, I usually can get away with more, but I'm also dieting, so maybe I'm not as fatigued as much there, right? So I think first and foremost, desire to train is there. I think soreness is a pretty good indicator for recovery. Maybe not specifically because sore means can't perform, but it's one of those things, again, that it might cause that mental chain of reactions where might limit yourself in performance, right?
Sure.
So I think the brain is such a powerful tool, and sometimes it can be our worst enemy. So navigating how we assess it ourselves and how we talk to ourselves about recovery and what these metrics mean, I think is also very important, right? So I think there's that. I mean, I kind of jumped ahead, but first and foremost, sleep, right? If my sleep's off, there's a pretty good chance with that too. If it's chronically low sleep, I think that's the key thing, right? If I'm just consistently getting under 6 hours, yeah, I need to be aware of that. But if one day I get 5 just because it happens, but all the other days are around 8 and 9, whatever it might be, I'm not going to go into that session thinking I'm going to perform
Right.
poorly, because
Probably fine.
then, yeah,
Yeah.
I'll probably be fine. But even then, some people can't get away with 5 like consistently. I'm not saying you should, and we have some research to say probably not for most people. But it's like, okay, am I sleeping properly? Stress levels, where's that at? Because again, training is very mental, especially bodybuilding training, when you need to kind of go there, both mentally and physically, right? With training close to failure or doing a lot of volume, either one comes with its own mental battles.
Yeah.
So I think, what are your stress levels at? You got a lot of work going on. Did you have a really shitty day at work and you're going into train right now? Are you good at turning switches on and off for, okay, school mode, work mode off, gym mode on? Hard to do, but some people can't do that, right? And I think there's something to consider too. So recovery metrics, yeah, sleep, stress, soreness, desire to train, kind of the big ones there in that sense. And yeah, desire and then readiness to train. I think they're slightly different. Desire is like, I want to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Readiness to train is, I may not want to be here, but I can perform and I can put in
Right.
work, right? So I think taking those either like 1 to 10 scales, however you may have it, either before training, during your training, or during your warm up, after your last warm up, right? Those are some things you can do to figure out like, where am I at, rather than coming in with the preconceived idea right away and just taking multiple data points.
I completely disagree. I think these princesses need to man up and just train hard. I mean,
To be honest, some of that is true. That is, and someone would say that, I'd be like, you know what, I could see that. And there are days where I tell myself that. So
yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
for sure.
there
But
there
for
is a
most
time and place
people,
for that, right?
yeah, exactly. For most
But
people, or if we have nowhere to start, how do we actually assess that? Right. And this is where maybe we're collecting some data, or maybe we're using these scales. But I could actually really agree with that. And that was probably me today for legs, because I'm like, oh no, pendulum squats and RDLs. And then I just hit like personal rep bests. I'm like, okay, I'm fine.
yeah, you surprise yourself. And
Yeah.
again, it also comes back to the goal, right? Like maximizing growth is important to you. So
Yeah.
you find a way to dig deep and get it done. If it's not their biggest goal, just come back tomorrow. It's fine. You know what I mean? Like if you're not super stoked to be there, it's not a huge deal. So as always, we got to come back to the person and their goals. And for the record, jokes aside, I do, all of those things are, we want to pay attention to everything together, right? Like there's not a single metric that's going to tell you, there's some research that like vertical jump, it might be a reasonable, good, practical indicator of your readiness to train for like strength in the squat or whatever.
Yeah. Or like velocity metrics, right? But most people don't have access to a kind of movement jump, or a velocity tracker.
Right.
So it's like, what are tangible things? Like 1 to 10 scales can be really good, right? Or just how you're actually feeling.
Yeah, and even like it's not like you have to like pull up a spreadsheet and rate it and write it. You don't have, just kind of self-awareness, right?
Yeah.
Just a little bit of self-awareness can go a long way. But I think as for any coaches or people who want to get into coaching listening, I think the biggest takeaway is that there's a lot of things that can contribute to the decision making. Fatigue and recovery stuff, soreness, all the psychological things you mentioned, sleep, stress. I think there's a not completely unreasonable argument to like think, do you get a pump when you train?
Mm-hmm.
If you never get any pumps whatsoever, no matter what you do, maybe you can do a little bit more. Like I think that's not a ridiculous notion. Anyway, there's a bunch of stuff that we can look at, but the key is don't get too bogged down in any one metric. Keep an open mind. Look at everything in totality. There's probably going to be, it gets messy, right? This is part of why I don't think it's helpful to have all of this stuff in a spreadsheet, because some things are going to be like increased volume. Other things are going to indicate decreased volume. Other things are going to be like you're in the sweet spot, right? So we got to just look at everything together and make a reasonable judgment call, and then just see how it goes, right? And then do the same thing next time. In that like iterative process, you're going to settle. Like if you, as the coach or the person writing the program, if you care about getting your clients good results and having them be a sustainable thing, you're going to find the sweet spot, right? Because you're going to make these adjustments, you're going to ask the questions, you're going to pay attention, and you're not going to be perfect from week one, right? Like, have you ever had a client where you didn't change the program at all ever? Like, probably not.
No.
You know what I mean?
No.
So like everybody, that's just part of the process, right? That's what coaching is adapting the stuff as we go. but nonetheless, I think we kind of beat the volume horse pretty well. Um, the tied together piece that we've already kind of touched on a little bit is that intensity piece. That, once we have our setup, we have our frequency, we have our quality is in place, right? Our technique is good. We're engaged mentally. We're not just going through the motions, all those things. We have a sort of a dosage thing that we're starting with the sets, but we got to make sure that those sets are worth our time, right? Like, we're not just in there moving stuff around for no reason. So how do you like to start on that front with figuring out how close to failure to get? Is it always the same? Does it change over time? Does it depend on what you're doing? How do you like to do that?
Yeah, I think as with most things, I'll look at the research is saying, and typically that's going to be between 0 and 4 reps in reserve. So I like to kind of put that as on average 2 reps in reserve. And this is especially true and mainly true for hypertrophy, right? So as long as you're at 2 reps in reserve on average for your set and for your sets of that exercise, I think you're golden, right? Can you get away with being closer to failure? Sure. Can you be the same place if you're further away? I think so too. And then from there, can determine how much volume you're doing, and that whole cycle happens again too, right? But I think on average, if you're at 2 reps in reserve, it's a pretty good place to be. And then I think what's nice about, again, we're going to relate back to that main goal. If we're trying to maximize hypertrophy, and like we talked about before as well, if I'm going to choose exercises that allow me to really push, such as machines and cables, where I'm also going to be a bit more safe in terms of, I don't have to dump a barbell, or I don't have to worry about my stability being a limiting factor. I can safely take it to failure if I really need to, and then just still be okay and safe. That's great, because I can then focus on stimulating the muscle like I want to, right? So this is where, again, having things set up early on is really going to come into play of how these variables interact down the line. So for most people trying to maximize hypertrophy, you can even get closer to 1 rep in reserve on average, right? But again, I think that's one of those things where a lot of people maybe get caught up of, well, what does that mean? Every set at 1 rep in reserve? Should I go 3, 2, 1, 0? Should I do 0 for all of them and then adjust load? Yes, maybe. Like, possibly. Again, can you recover from that? Are you still able to perform? Is the muscle that we're trying to target still the limiting factor within each set? Or once you get to set 3, you're still struggling to breathe? Because even though we're using a hack squat, it's a hack squat, and that's pretty damn tough to still get through, right? Maybe you're breathing heavy, maybe you're not bracing properly, or maybe something else is taking over. Where in this case, we don't want that to be. So I think on average, just train hard, bro. But yeah, two reps in reserve on average is a good place to be. And I think to defend myself from the attacks by Jake earlier, that he does it differently for his clients. That's also why I like to be, just kidding, but that's why I like to focus on the quality of the sets first, meaning make sure your RER accuracy is there. Because if we could theoretically get away with less, I'm not saying that we want to or need to, that's kind of nice, especially because most of the people maybe that I work with, we only have so much time in the gym, or we can only do so much. So we only have 4 sets to do in the session for chest. It will be the best damn 4 sets you can ever do. That's to the point where maybe we don't need to do more. If we get to a position where we can do more, absolutely. Because like we said, there's some research showing that's probably going to be, a better indicator. We're getting closer and making a greater chance that we'll achieve that hypertrophy goal that we want to. So yeah.
For sure. No, I think that's great. I think I also agree that the around 2 or so on average is a really, really great place to hang out. I mentioned Zach's meta-analysis earlier about like, on average, seems like the most growth happens at failure, but you still grow at 10 RIR, right? And there's some limitations involved with that analysis anyway. No analysis is perfect, right? But so like, when that came out and people were like, hey, we should do every set to failure always. It's like, that's not really the right, that's not the best takeaway, I think. But I think it also, it made a lot of people train closer to failure than they were. And I think,
me included, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that we've sort of collectively realized we can kind of push harder than we thought we could. Like, you can probably get away with more than you think. And again, if only hypertrophy is your goal. If strength is also a goal, we got other stuff to consider. But, I think if you just, like, if you're like me and you enjoy training, 2 RIR at the most, cool, right? We can do that. Maybe we can't get away with as much volume, in which case we then need to decide, is this worth it? Or should we stay a bit further from failure so we can do more volume? Again, there's no clear correct answer. It just kind of, depends on where you fall and what you feel the most confident in prioritizing, right? I don't, they're both going to work, and it's probably a very, very tiny difference. Even if you pick the wrong one, quote unquote, you're, let's be realistic. You're not going to be able to measure the difference.
Yeah.
You would need an MRI machine or something. Anyway, so I do a very similar thing. Again, thinking about making sure the quality is there first, all that good stuff. Especially things where we're getting really close or to failure, probably machines are the way to go, or like a dumbbell curl or whatever, right? But barbell back squat, probably not the best choice for sets to like all out failure. And I think it's also important to keep in mind, especially for lower body training, you can probably push a lot harder than you think. A legit 2 RIR is extremely difficult, right? Extremely difficult. And it's, it's just good to keep that in mind, I think, right? And it's also good to keep, like, there's different kinds of failure, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So there's like the, I'm imagining that, I'm in the original History of Trunks movie, right? And I'm Trunks, the androids just killed Gohan, and like I'm going to warpath vengeance, right? There's that failure of nothing will get in my way, I'm getting another rep, right? There's also the like you're just kind of going through it and like, oh, I can't do another one. It's just much more like, it's still, you can't do another rep, but it's much more casual. If you were as amped up as that first example, you're probably able to get more reps, right? I think we've all kind of been there. And so it's important, I think, to delineate that also. So if you tend to err more on the side of the more casual failure, quote unquote, you can probably get away with, on average, much closer to failure, if not to failure, on almost everything, because like it's not actually all out failure if we're being super, super honest. So it's just things to keep in mind. But the bottom line, like you said, the bottom line is just get pretty close to failure and you're going to be fine, right? Because if we're doing this, what I think we would agree is generally a very good way to go about it, which is sort of each week we're looking back at our performance last week and like, can I meet or exceed that in some way? Or, and you're not going to do that every week with every exercise or whatever, but on average over time, are we doing more load for the similar rep range? Are we doing more reps with similar load? What have you? If we're doing this progressive overload thing over time, you're naturally going to get closer to failure anyway. So it just kind of solves itself, So it's just like volume. It's just like everything else, dude. Like there's no dire straits of like, oh, I did the wrong thing and it's just not going to work. Like it's at worst, it's going to be okay. And then you just dial it in over time as you get that feedback from the client and progressively overload and all that.
Yeah, and that's why we often say that just collect data, try stuff out, experiment. We're technically doing science with ourselves and our clients because we are. And that's why, again, we're using the science as a place to start, seeing what happens there, how we're recovering, how we're responding, what's desired to train look like, all these metrics that we could potentially use. Then from there, okay, let's add a little bit more. Let's see what happens. Instead of 8 sets, we're going to go to 10, or maybe we go to 12, or throughout our 8-week cycle, we increase from 8 to 12. And then for the next bucket, okay, 12 is very recoverable for you. Let's start at 12 and see what happens there. Oh, yeah. We realize maybe 15 is about that threshold where we got to be mindful of recovery. So maybe we don't hang out there too much, right? Or maybe your quads are responding better to lower volume because if you're at 15, you're torched too frequently. So either way, it's important to have some data to work with because it's, again, individualization, like we talked about in the beginning. It's going to be different from person to person. We want to tailor it to those differences while also keeping in mind the goal. So there's going to be all these things that even if we run a block that is conservative, so to speak, we're still gaining so much data. And we'd rather be conservative to start than go too quick, too early on. Because on the worst case scenario, maybe we get injured because we throw 20 sets at you right away and we're going to failure and everything. Probably don't want to do that for most people, right? Start on the lower end, see where you're at, build up from there, and then adjust, right? Experimentation should be small changes. So one, we know what we change is what causes any potential difference in the end, because we want to make sure that's accurate too. And two, from there, assessing where we can make more changes potentially down the line. So it's you got to collect the data and start probably low to be sure.
For sure. I've had the very fun opportunity to be able to do. I've had a handful of clients where they've been willing to be a guinea pig
Yeah.
to, this thing we've kind of talked about, like, should we prioritize volume or proximity to failure? And it's such an interesting question. And I've had people who are willing to see what happens, basically, right? So sort of what I've done with a handful of people now is like, we have the volume that we've been doing that seems like it's working well, right? All metrics indicate we're heading in the right direction. Cool. This average volume, this average RIR, whatever. So then what I've done is like, okay, and we'll go through that, we'll deload, we come back, ensure we kind of ramp up a little bit, but let's keep the RIR a little bit higher and add some sets and just kind of see what happens, right? Like, are you still recovering okay? Okay, cool. Can I get the RIR back lower now and get closer to failure with more sets? And just seeing, does getting closer to failure now sabotage their ability to do more volume, or is it fine? And like, oh, we just found out we can push harder in general. They're still recovering. They're still fitting within their constraints, whatever. They're still enjoying it. Sweet. Like, we just found out that's better. Or, maybe you find out that like, even with pulling back the RIR initially, that added volume was immediately too much. It's like, okay, bad idea, and like just playing with both of those levers over the next couple blocks and just seeing, does doing more volume sabotage our ability to get close to failure or vice versa? And that's been really interesting. And it seems kind of individual, to be honest, limited sample size, right? It's not like I'm seeing this with hundreds and hundreds of people, but it seems kind of hit and miss. But on average, it seems like I've been able to find I'd say on average a sweet spot of like, we can push harder than we thought, but there certainly is a tipping point where, ramping both of them up, like, we do eventually have to choose. And like we said earlier, like, dealer's choice on which of those that you feel the most comfortable with. But
And I
anyway,
think that's a great way to approach it and a great thing to think about, because like you said, and we can refer to both intensity and volume, we could probably get away with more than what we think. We could probably train harder than what we
not that
think.
you have to, though,
You don't have
right?
to,
Like,
yeah, but maybe there's, like you said, there's a case to it depending on where you're at with training. If you have some more experience with if you've done through a couple things and you're still looking for a little bit more, testing around, where does that threshold lie, right? And
yeah,
then where can we be comfortably where we can string together good training blocks, right?
yeah,
And this is something you can look forward to if you're just starting to train. You say, hey, like, should I be thinking about that? No, again, nail the basics, because that's where you're going to get it. But you get to the point where, okay, I got a really good foundation. I want to take to the next step. Let me see where maybe some thresholds lie, and then use that to my advantage and experiment. Because again, we're still going to get some really good data, and from there we can kind of get that arrow a lot closer to the center hole, so to speak, in terms for
yeah,
that goal. So I think that's the cool thing about this data coming out is, hey, it gives us just a little bit of direction. Whether or not we keep going in that direction or we choose one thing, who knows? For me, yeah, I can be training harder. I now am training harder, and I'm realizing, wow, I can push it more, right? And that's helped me out. For some people, okay, actually, they're good where they're at. Maybe they can do a little more volume. Let's try some
yeah,
more volume, right? And that's where it comes. It's find a place to start, collect some data, and see where we
100%.
go.
Yeah. And that seems to be that was me too. Literally, my first check-in with my coach ever
Yeah.
was him being like, "Oh, bro, you just don't train enough." Like, literally the first one. But then other people, it's like, dude, you're doing way too much. Like, so it's, we don't want people to hear this and think that they have to go do more. If you don't want to, if your goal isn't to be optimal, which is totally fine. Like, it's a weird thing on social media. It kind of seems like if you're not trying to be optimal, then like, why are you even doing this? That's stupid, right? Like, do what you enjoy. It's fine. There's a lot other things in life. But yeah, ultimately, at the end of the day, we've talked about our big picture, important starting points, and then it's just getting that feedback, getting that data, and adjusting from there. And you're going to figure out what to do, and that kind of takes care of everything, right? Like, you'll see people like, I'm, should I do something different for males versus females, or older versus younger clients, or this population, that population? Like, if you do this process, you're going to wind up in a good sweet spot for them, right? That's individualized and all that good stuff. So probably don't have to stress about it.
Exactly. Yeah. you got a place to start, and then from there, collect the data. Then from there, is this like if you're reading information, trying to figure out if I should do this, is this appropriate for me? Does this fall in line with my goals? Does this can I do this? Is the resources there? Energy availability, time, all that. And then can I recover from it? You go through this checklist of sorts, and then you figure it out and you tailor it for you. So it's kind of program design in a nutshell, right? And again, there's so much to it, but to keep it simple, I think that's again like that's how we take our clients through it, right? We just kind of explain this is what we do. We never have the perfect plan ever, period, but especially early on, right? We have a place to start, and then we go from there. But it's important that one, if you're coaching someone, you explain that and you say, hey, we got to do something. We got to we need to collect some data first off. And this is why I'm making these choices. Research says 8 to 20 sets. We're going to start on the lower end and to go from there, right? You're giving some rationale and you have some evidence behind it. And then from there, you just, time. It takes time. It really does. Right? You're never going to get it perfect. Even, dude, I mean, we've been training, 10 years? I learn like every block. I'm like, this is the best block I've had. Next block, this is one of the best blocks I've ever had. Because I just keep learning more, right? And it's just not every block's gonna be that way. It's not gonna be continuously linear like that. But I'm always gonna be gaining something, and always gonna be enjoying training, and that's the most important.
For sure,
right?
Yeah, we've that's the dude. Research is in such a cool place right now because we're finding out some really cool things. And it was like last year we had getting closer to failure, like probably training closer to failure is a little bit better. So that kind of changed some things for some people. Or, like when our meta came out again, with some of these other, like the NS study and like all these huge, really high volume studies, if you take the concept away and not be like, oh, I have to do 52 sets a week for every, for every muscle, like don't do that. Right. But like the concept of you can probably do more volume and blah, blah, blah. As we talked about, like that can cause a little shift. All the muscle length stuff, right? That's probably a good idea to be exposed to a deep stretch under load, at least some of the time, right? Probably good. There's all that kind of stuff. And it's exciting to think about where things are going to kind of continue to go and like what we can learn and what we can tweak and make those small improvements, like you're saying, and have some of these blocks that even though we've been training for a long time, now we know another thing, right? We can do this other thing, and if nothing else, maybe it's just more fun. That's also a win, or maybe it's larger structural stuff, or not to be too much of a tease, like we'll have our per session volume meta-analysis coming out in the not too distant future, hopefully, that like that might help give some direction on some other things to do, like when you're splitting up. We mentioned frequency, right? And how the days don't all have to be even. Well, this meta-analysis might help inform a little bit how you might do some of that kind of stuff, or what have you, right? But so we'll leave that as a teaser. We'll talk about the results when they're available. But yeah, right. Good starting points. Adjust from there. Figure it out. Keep learning. Keep being open to new information. And at the end of the day, 52 sets a week, bro split, everything to failure. Just train hard. Ignore your feelings.
Finally,
Feelings over
someone
data.
says it. That's what I've been waiting for, and it's
Yeah.
not true. But I mean, when you think about it, we're giving away the secrets in quotations, right? Like this is actually what it comes down to. But it's just again that idea of it takes time and it's hard. And even us explaining this, there's so much more to explain. But thankfully, if you're someone who wants to expedite that process, learn a little bit more, get some more direction, because like as you've heard, there's a lot to consider, right? If you don't want to do that thinking on your own, have someone else do it. Hit us up for coaching, right? That's what we're here for too. We of course want to share the information as much as we can, but some people, again, they want that more personalized approach. They want to get there a little bit quicker, which you can totally understand. And like we talked about in the previous episodes, so many ways you can do that. One-time consults, it could be one-on-one coaching for a month, 2 months, 7 years, whatever you want. But just let us know. We're open. We got
Preferably
you.
7 years. I prefer 7 because I want to be friends, right? It takes longer than a month to be like, I also want all your money, but no, I want to be friends.
Yeah.
Kidding.
Yeah,
but jokes aside, right? Like it can take some time in the longer term process. It sounds like a sales pitch, but like genuinely, it makes a world of difference.
And coming from us who were in the space of research and understanding it and interpreting it, as more stuff comes out, to be honest, it's going to get more confusing. So having someone to understand how to actually navigate, like Jake put so well so many times before, like, hey, this study just tells us we should probably be training harder rather than you need to do 52 sets or you need to be training to failure. So having someone to reach out to and be like, hey, coach, what do you got? What do you think here? And that's a big part of what a coach is there for, which is very nice. So if you got options, again, don't have to. We're always happy to help. We're happy that you're here just listening. That honestly means the world to us, and we appreciate you all very much. But yeah, other than that, great episode, great stuff. Thanks for being here, everyone. Jake, thanks for coming back to me after leaving me in my dream. So
Good to be back.
good to be
Like I
back.
said, though, this is just the epilogue. Okay, this is the last time that we'll talk.
All right, this sounds
I
like
got cooler friends now. Okay.
this sounds like Berserk. I'm reading it, and this is what it sounds like, and I'm kind of afraid to where it's gonna go. But
Okay, really quick, how far are you in? No huge spoilers, but like how far are you?
just finished chapter 8.
Okay, so you're pretty early.
Pretty early. They're still in the golden age.
Have you hit
Okay.
a flashback yet?
There's been a lot. Like, so I'll talk
Like a
after this.
big flashback?
Kind of. Yes. Yeah. I don't want to spoil people. I will tell you after this. But
Okay.
if you're still here, thank you. Much love. We'll catch you in the
Go
next
read Berserk.
episode. Go read Berserk.